lot of talk about the idea of unity, wholeness, oneness, and then we set up an idea, a conflicting idea that says that duality is actually the illusion, right? But yet duality is actually the plane of existence that we exist at, that we comprehend and are a part of. And the idea of oneness or unity and a kind of a unified idea is actually the abstract idea that is not fundamental to our actual living experience. But we seem to have failed to realize that duality is actually the unified field behaving. It's actually the unified field that's in motion or in action as a form of expression of itself. So they're actually not apart and separate from each other, but one is actually the inherent nature or the actual behavior of the other one. And so, but we have to, the reason we form these type of misperceptions is because we're trying to form a perception of unity from a different plane of existence without breaking reality down into its fundamental level, so that we can gain an understanding of the fact that all of life exists as a correspondence or as aspects of itself at different levels of creation. And in spiritual sciences or esoteric sciences, we start off every process by breaking everything down into energetic terms, because energy, of course, is the fundamental reality. It's the universal principles that exist in certain types of matrices that define behavior. Principles are how systems behave. It describes the movement or the pattern that a system takes on, but it doesn't have anything to do with the actual elements that are being used to compose that behavior or being used as a means of orchestrating the movement. So, but by breaking it down into fundamental terms also helps us to learn to perceive through terms of unity, because it requires us, when we look at life from an energetic, symbolic level, it requires interpretation in order to form a perception of reality from a different perspective, so to speak. When we're trying to perceive things from a level of interpretation, or of where it's already been expressed and somebody's got an opinion about it, and somebody has already interpreted certain type, a certain group of facts to mean something, and they convey knowledge as an opinion, it tends to it's kind of like starting off in midstream, or we're starting off trying to form a basis of knowledge on in midstream, already interpreted by somebody else. And the beauty of spiritual sciences is that it honors the individual creativity by saying that by teaching sciences that explain or describe nature at a fundamental level, requiring the individual to form their own interpretation of the system, of the universal principles as a means of obtaining knowledge, perfectly honors, it develops the individual's intuitive abilities to discern reality by seeing the interconnectedness of it, by seeing how things exist as in relationship to each other, or as a correspondence or an analogy of each other. But it also honors that individual to be able to take knowledge and perceive it through where they're at in their life, through their exact level of development, as it pertains to their exact situation or circumstances, so that it has the greatest meaning possible, and it automatically indicates practical application. There's automatically a means for that person to implement that knowledge into their daily life, to actually live it, or create experiences out of it, which is what knowledge really is. Knowledge is taken a base, kind of like a base form of knowledge, or a base form of facts, as scientific knowledge of the fundamental aspects of nature itself, and being able to interpret it in such a way that personalizes a universal theme as a means of creating an experience of it in our everyday life. And through the experience, we acquire the knowledge in a fully integrated fashion, right? We learn by the experience of it, and therefore we come to know it. So this is entirely different than hearing something that sounds pretty good, right? Because see, the other thing that tends to happen that we really misinterpret our intuitive abilities is how our intuition perceives bigger things. It connects dots. It sees whole ideas. So when we come into a situation and we hear something that somebody's saying that has an aspect or a remnant of truth in it, there's a part of us that identifies that, and we kind of recognize it and resonate with it. And if we don't have the knowledge base that says, through our resonance, we're identifying what aspect of this equation does have truth or does contain truth, we tend to think that because we're identifying truth of some sort, that the whole idea is, expressing a truth. When in fact, it may not be expressing a truth at all. So this is very common in cases like where we say, as a means of trying to create a perception of unity, we speak of duality as being the illusion, right? That we have to see, that has no behavior. What does that mean exactly, right? I mean, if our experience is duality and we see each other as, or see everything in life as being apart and separate from us, and then somebody tells us that this is the illusion, it's not real, right? And that we're really all unified, but it doesn't give us a means of perceiving the unity through the duality, those things don't mean anything. We can't practice them. We can't bring them into life. We can't know them by experience, right? Which is the only way we truly know. All true knowledge, as it pertains to truth, can be lived in order to obtain the truth of it. So what we tend to do is intuitively we sense the truth, so we say, okay, well, I believe that because intuitively I know it's true, and I keep holding it in my mind because I know it seems to speak the truth. We use those type of terminologies without being able to identify that it's actually just kind of has a little bit of a truth in it, but the rest of the system is basically built off of a fundamental error. Okay, so to say that duality is an illusion is almost like forming a perception from the error, which is the illusion of duality, because we're not recognizing that duality is actually the whole in motion. It's actually the whole that's behaving as a whole, as a system. There's an interaction taking place. But the other thing too is when we look at spiritual sciences is that it teaches intuitive ability, so to speak, which is also our creative ability, because it gives us information in symbols or shows the relationship between all different aspects of things, that is like connecting dots that allows us to see how things exist in relationship to each other, or how things exist as an interrelated ecological system of wholeness and unification. So what I want to do is I want to convey ideas, break everything back down to an energetic term, and convey just some basic ideas that is a demonstration of sacred sciences as an art form, okay? And it really helps us to kind of gives us a model that helps us to perceive reality in a different way. And the first thing that we want to start with is the idea of one, right? And the idea of one, of course, can be symbolized with what we call the phallic symbol, or the straight unformed line. And this also indicates, of course, the upper is the same as the lower, as above, so below. It's a motion of movement that says that the macro becomes the micro, right? So we have a flow, a direction of flow as a reed, a conduit, a tunnel, so to speak, for energy to flow through from the cosmos into physical existence. Now, if we look at this from above, it appears as a spot, or a small circle. And if we understand that all matter has its what we call invisible twin, or that the only way matter can express in the physical world is if it has some kind of a parameter or it's confined to an area of influence. And we know this because movement, which is necessary for vibration, if it doesn't have a wall to hit up against and then and bounce back at certain angles, does not create flow, but rather just shoots off endlessly into space. So the single one has what we call a sphere of influence, which is represented by the dot within the circle. And the circle, of course, is often represented as the snake eating its own tail, right? Because it's kind of creating a sphere of influence that's based on one and the same thing, the beginning and the end, or the individual as a complete unit, as a cyclical movement. So we have that, and then if we have, of course, 2 is the double, which creates symbolically what we refer to as pillars, or a gateway that we move through, but the masculine and the feminine, positive, negative energy, electromagnetic, they're all basically talking of the same thing, is represented by pillars of different color. One is light as positive, and one is dark as negative. Now the 2 are actually a regeneration of the 1. So the 1 separates and becomes the 2. The 2 is, if we look at the same kind of dynamic, forms that type of image, which in each, as our sphere of influence that overlaps each other, we create within this shape right here what we call interference patterns, which interference patterns means that the influence of 2 fields come together and kind of interrupt each other, or kind of serve to antagonize each other or conflict and hit up against each other, restructuring a new pattern in this area where they connect. This area also naturally produces what we call the vesica piscis, which is very symbolic of the vagina or the birth canal. So in this area right here, because it creates the two together create a brand new pattern, it's considered as birthing an expression that is a combination of the 2 patterns that come together and restructure into a new pattern. So, and then, so this is what we would call the basic fundamental reality as the 1 that separates and regenerates into the 2. So the 1 that separates into 2 forms what we call the triangle or the pyramid shape, and a horizontal line is reflective of a plane of existence. So just like the horizon, horizontal. So this right here is demonstrating a level of existence where the 1 now, as in a state of duality, exists so that it can move or create an actual physical effect in the physical plane. Because you see, material reality as we know it is based on vibration. Vibration is movement, so if when the 1 exists in a unified state, it doesn't exist because there's no vibration. Once it exists, once it separates into opposite poles of itself, this allows for movement between the poles as contained in the sphere of the 1 that creates vibration that allows the 1 to express itself and creates an effect, a lighting effect, so to speak, in the physical world so that we can perceive it as something, okay? And then the movement between these 2 poles is represented, I should say, by what we call the infinity symbol. Now the infinity symbol, which is, you want to notice this is an 8 inverted to a horizontal plane that makes it, has the movement at a horizontal level rather than a vertical level. But this right here is what sets up the primary vibration of the 1 that becomes identifiable through what we call a quality that creates a certain type of vibratory frequency that forms a certain type of resonance that structures specific patterns, so to speak. But and this is what we also want to notice too, is because these two aspects are actually, just like our body, we have, right brain, left brain. Our heart has two chambers that it operates in sync to pump blood to the system. We have two lungs, two ovaries, two kidneys. Our body is set up in a symmetry where the one body is in a dynamic interaction of duality, of pairs that form perfect and exact opposites of each other. But they're still the same thing. They're just allowing for an interaction to take place that is necessary for expression. Expression is only possible through limitation. So when we're talking about masculine and feminine, we want to keep in mind that we're really talking about a movement or a kind of behavior that takes place, an interaction that takes place between two poles. So, because, okay, the movement, okay, the masculine, which is what we call the initiating, the assertive, the expansive energy, initiates the movement, which kind of flows down, pushing on, creating pressure, pushing on the feminine aspect, and the feminine aspect resists or moves away from, because of the pushing action, it naturally pushes. It's like pressure. You have an inflated balloon, and you squeeze one side of it, and it bowls out into the other side. So it creates pressures by pushing down on the feminine, which resists and move away from the masculine. And this is where we get ideas like that what we pursue, we push away from us. What we resist persists. These type of ideas. What they're actually identifying is not a conscious idea that's working within a physical plane of effects. It's saying that this is just the natural behavior of consciousness as energy. So when we press down or really assert ourselves in certain situations, our first experience is that we literally push away the very thing that we're pursuing or that we're pressing on, that we're creating pressure around. And in the mating game, you want to notice a lot of language with energy is it's sexual in nature, right? And there's a reason for this. But so the masculine energy pursues the feminine energy or pushes down on the feminine energy, and the feminine energy moves away from him, or the woman's job, so to speak, is to resist, to play hard to get, right? And that way the man has to kind of like overcome her or win her over or woo her with his, his charisma and his manliness in order for her to succumb to him or give in to him or allow him into her space, so to speak. So, and here's another thing that we have kind of lost our insight around, is that when this presses down, pushes out, and hits this barrier around here, it creates a pressure which moves up until it hits what we could call a threshold. Now a threshold is extremely significant in any kind of chemical reaction, or like the hormonal system of the endocrine glands operates off of what we call a threshold basis. So once it builds pressure and builds up, it hits a threshold, it then releases and flows, turns back onto itself and flows. The energy has a release, and all that energy, or that quality of energy, completely flows into the system, altering its state, right? And if we look at this from a different perspective, this also shows us what we call, in healing arts, we say we have a term for this that's called the healing crisis. Now the healing crisis says that before something gets better, it gets worse, right? It's like the fever that rises until it hits a peak, and then it plateaus briefly and then breaks. So, and that break can be perceived as when it hits enough pressure or enough influence of a certain type that it actually hits what we call an exalted state that shifts it into a different state or a different dimension, level of existence, plane of operation, all those type things, which if we look at our world situation right now, it tells us, everything makes sense now, right? It tells us that in order for us to make the shift that we keep talking about into, back into what we call an ascending state, or ascending to a higher level of expression, a higher dimension of being, I mean, all those type of terms are basically talking about the same idea. Things are going to have to get worse, right? And they are. They're escalating, they're intensifying, and they're building in pressure. And this is just a natural flow of energy that says it has to, so that it hits the point where it creates a threshold, and then it can dissipate or release and flow back onto itself and begin the whole process all over again, right? But it changes the state of the being, and then it begins forming a different type of pressure that brings into expression a different aspect of itself. And the other way we can look at this is what we would call one form of expression, and this is what we call another. And the reason I say that we can't really define feminine in specific terms is because what we are defining as feminine is actually identifying a form of movement that takes place. Because once this releases and flows back, then what we perceive as being feminine is now taking an assertive action and pressing down on the masculine, which causes and forms the same escalation, hits a threshold, and then releases, which brings the masculine aspect into expression. As it escalates and breaks and then goes back and brings the feminine. And this kind of is descriptive of the kind of like the tandem teamwork that goes on between the right and left hemisphere of, accessing feelings and then thoughts, as a way of forming them into a whole idea. But it also represents that the feminine and the masculine are actually different aspects or different parts of the same flow or the universal principle of movement. So we want to look at that. And this point right here, which is what we call the equalized state in the middle, which would be indicative of no movement or balanced movement, however you want to look at it, indicates the gateway. You have two pillars, right? The doorway is represented by two pillars. Very common in ancient architecture was the top that resembled this, which was actually a half of the symbol of the vagina or the birth canal, supported by the two pillars of masculine and feminine, and you entered into the middle of this or walked through this gate into a different environment or into a different place. So it kind of represents that in this movement, in an equalized state, is what allows a shift into a higher dimension, or allows us to walk through the gate into a higher experience.